Hello, YouTubers. Welcome to AP World History Vocabulary. And today we're going to be looking at the Protestant Reformation and vocabulary included in the Protestant Reformation. So this is going to be a broad overview of what brought this about, what were the causes, what were the effects, and then what were some changes and continuities in Europe following the Protestant Reformation. So let us begin. First of all, in order to understand the Protestant Reformation, we really kind of have to understand early Christianity in Europe. And so, if you recall, Christianity began with the teachings of Christ that had been written down by his disciples. About 100 years after his death is when the first churches started to really become powerful. Christianity was adopted by Constantinople, who was the Eastern Roman Emperor. In Rome is where the seat of the Roman Catholic Church was and still is. And so this is kind of where and how Christianity became a more powerful religion when it was kind of adopted and officially made the religion of the Roman Empire. Of course, the Roman Empire fell. The church did not fall. The church remained strong. The church was actually probably one of the reasons the Roman Empire fell, is because people had more adherence to God than to the emperor. So the Eastern Roman Empire lived on, and as they lived on, there was the split, the Great Schism, which we talked about in our last unit of study. At 1054 is when essentially the Eastern Roman Emperor said, I want to kind of wrestle some power from the Pope. There was a few arguments over different rituals and customs, what type of bread they should use, whether or not priests should marry. And the effect was that two churches were formed. So in the West, the Roman Catholic Church remained powerful, and in the East, the Eastern Orthodox Church became powerful. And really, the dividing line between these two churches was kind of right in the dividing line between Eastern and Western Europe. For the most part, Western Europe remained Catholic, and Eastern Europe, and then later Russia, became Eastern Orthodox. So the next big challenge was the Crusades, and the Crusades was when the Western Church, led by the Pope, declared essentially war on Islam, and the Islamic empires, the Muslim empires in the East, being very powerful, taking what was considered the Christian Holy Land, simply because that's where Jesus lived, and there was some of the early monuments of Christianity. So these wars that were fought over 200 years were incredibly violent. They led to a deep rift that had already existed between Christians and Muslims, who had, although they wouldn't acknowledge it, a very similar religion, but they were direct opponents to one another. And while Europe didn't exactly win the Crusades, they were able to become much more advanced due to their contact with the East. Because the Muslim empires had more contact with India and China, that learning was transferred over to the Europeans, and so that was a good thing. In Europe, medieval Europe, the church and state had kind of a separation, but a loose separation. So we have two different systems here which developed of leadership. First, the church was headed by the Pope, who had cardinals who would advise the Pope, and then there were bishops who were in charge of large groups of churches, and then priests who conducted services at individual churches and communities, and also directed the monks and nuns. On the political side of things, the kings were the political leaders who operated under this feudal system where local lords pledged their support, pledged their knights for warfare purposes, and were supported by the farmers or the peasants, the serfs, who really were kind of at the lowest part of the society because they had no real mobility. So you could see that essentially under this feudal system, the kings held the most power, but the Pope, being the head of the religious factor in society, held more sway than probably anybody in all of Western Europe. So hence this Holy Roman Empire, which never really developed into anything big because of all these different kings. The kings were still kind of under the control of the Pope. in the local communities, the people who actually kind of did service for the people in those villages or manors were the monks and the nuns. The monks and the nuns' lives consisted of labor for the most part. They had devoted their entire life to the church, and so prayer, worship, and labor were uh, their their main duties. And then, as far as serving the community, they acted as a social welfare system in a lot of ways, providing health care, providing child care, especially for orphans, and then charity to those who were poor. And another big part of their lives was copying texts, mostly the Bible, because the printing press had not been developed in Europe uh, before the 15th century. So, and they were kind of led by the Benedictine rule, which said essentially that monks and nuns would obey the church, take a vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience to the church. And this was essentially enforced to prevent any corruption and to keep the moral high ground in the church. Now, this is a quick little question. Who had the power in medieval Europe? And you should say the kings, and then in the spiritual side, the religious side, the Pope. And it's difficult to say if the Pope or the kings had more power. And who had poverty? And you would probably come about with the question or with the answer to this question as the serfs, but also monks and nuns. And then any areas where conflict might occur. Well, that's what we're going to dig into next. So let's check this out. First of all, the Roman Catholic Church has a concept that is pretty familiar with all Christian religions of sin. And sin in the Roman Catholic Church is divided into two different types of sin. The first is original sin. Because of the actions of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, humans are born with this type of sin and therefore need forgiveness in order to have eternal life. And then there's personal sin, which is what people can rack up during their lifetime. So symbolized here by this little bad guy with his bag of money and his gun. But also the personal sin can be anything within a person's heart, which is causing them to move away from holiness. So these 7 deadly sins are the ones which maybe people can't see on the outside, but that people know they have on the inside. So confession of sin is important in order to make it to heaven. And remember, that's the goal of life. So the church also had this kind of this place called purgatory, which was this waiting room kind of before people could enter heaven. And the idea is that it's a little bit unfair for somebody who has committed a lot of personal sin to make it into heaven at the exact same time as somebody who lived a very virtuous life. And so purgatory was kind of the equalizer, that if you needed to pay for some of your sins before you get into heaven, then you would spend a lot of time in purgatory. And the more personal sin you had, the more time you'd be spending in purgatory. So a person would be very concerned with making sure that they spend as little time as possible in purgatory, because it was as bad as hell, essentially, except you're not going to end up going to hell. So how do we kind of make a relationship between purgatory and real life? And as a student, you can probably relate to this. Where do you go if you don't deserve to be suspended or expelled from school, but you do need to receive some sort of punishment? And the answer is detention of some sort. In our school, we might have Friday school or in-school suspension, where you sit in a room quietly and you serve your time. People hate waiting, right? Waiting in lines at the DMV or in the doctor's office or anywhere, even in traffic. We hate waiting. And so imagine having to spend all that time just waiting. This is kind of what purgatory is. So how can you get out of detention? And essentially, you can make up some sort of excuse and try to get out of it, but that'll probably catch up with you later on. You might be able to try to skip it, but you're going to get caught. And there's no other real way out of it except to serve your time. What if, though, you could pay your way out of detention? And there's a couple of ways you can think about doing this. I imagine if you went up to the detention teacher and said, "Listen, I'm bored. Is there a way that I could do some service around the school? Maybe pick up trash while I'm here in order to get out of this room?" And I bet you they'd be willing to say yes as long as you had some sort of supervision. But what if you came up to them and said, "Listen, I'm bored. I've got money in my pocket. Can I just get out this way?" Would this be fair? And the idea of what would be unfair about it is obviously people who have more money would be able to get out of detention, but also people wouldn't really learn their lesson. They would learn that paying a fine is kind of forgiveness for whatever they did to get in there. So, and the benefit, obviously, if we paid money to get out of detention, would be that the school could use that money for the greater good. So, possibly it wouldn't be a bad idea for people to pay money to get out of detention, because the school might be able to take that money and reinvest it into programs which maybe help all students in general. So this is very similar to a policy in the Catholic Church, which was having to do with indulgences. So let's take a look at indulgences. The Church granted indulgences to people on the basis of not exactly forgiving them for sins, but excusing them from time spent in purgatory, essentially. So the Church granted indulgences to people to cover this time spent in purgatory, and most people earned it by doing some kind of prayer or sacrament or ritual in the Church that was earned. So confession of sin, and then some sort of penance in order to uh, get out of purgatory a little bit earlier. And the interesting thing is, these could be earned for people who were still alive, or for yourself, or for others who were already dead and presumably spending time in purgatory. The Church, however, began to sell indulgences, and this meant taking money from people in order to grant them these indulgences instead of having to spend the time doing that themselves. So the Church used this money because they needed it to have different building projects that they had at the time, but also the people in the community started to kind of become upset. So this is where the Protestant Reformation really began, was with this practice of selling indulgences. So let's take a look at the action that took place. The Church, because of this indulgence selling, it led itself to corruption, and this was not exactly promoted by the Pope, but was kind of a byproduct of this practice. So wealth and power of the Church started to grow, and in local areas, the clergy became a little more worldly and would consume more luxuries. Monks and nuns in some areas would ignore their vows, definitely not all of them, but some. And it led to moral decay in the church, and a little bit of corruption, which people started to get fed up with. So we know that the peasants, who already don't have very much in this community, might be really upset by this fact that the church, who is their kind of supposed to be the moral high ground, is becoming more corrupt. So one of those, who was a monk, a Catholic monk named Martin Luther, had a set of beliefs that he had developed over time, and he believed that the Bible would kind of save people if people were allowed to read the Bible. So the Bible was truth, not the Pope, and the only way to heaven is by faith, not good deeds. And so he felt strongly that these good deeds, which people did to pay for their sins, was not correct, that the only way is through a personal relationship with God, and that only God can forgive those sins, and that indulgences, therefore, were not correct, because indulgences were the church forgiving sins for something that humans had done, and not God forgiving sins. So disagreed with this practice, and felt essentially that the church, the Catholic Church, was tricking people into believing that they had been saved or were going to heaven, and in reality were not. And so Martin Luther very famously nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the church in Germany, where he was a monk, and kind of immediately triggered off the Protestant Reformation. So what these theses say? So let's take a look at what these 95 Theses did actually say. The first, well, this is just kind of like the greatest hits of some of them. So if we read through number 5, number 21, 27, and 94, we see kind of a theme developing. The fifth one says the Pope has neither the will nor the power to remove any penalties from sin, essentially saying the Pope can't take away your sin. Only God can do that. 21, hence these preachers of indulgences are wrong when they say that a man is saved from sin by the Pope's indulgences, that nobody can be forgiven by a man. It would take God or Jesus. It is mere human talk on number 27 to preach that the soul flies out of purgatory immediately after the money clinks in the collection box. So he's attacking the practice of selling indulgences, saying that this isn't going to help you either. And that his second to last thesis here, Christians should seek earnestly to follow Christ, the head of the church. Saying here basically that the Pope is not the head of the church. Christ is the head of the church. So this sets off kind of a firestorm in the Catholic Church, and Martin Luther is excommunicated. So he is officially kind of kicked out of the Catholic Church. And this is a big deal because he was a very religious man and had devoted his life to the Catholic Church. So what did he do? He, instead of pleading for forgiveness, he went his own way and basically kept preaching his own beliefs. So the Protestant Reformation was based on not only Martin Luther, but others as well. And the goal here was to protest the Catholic Church to reform it. The two root words here, Protestant and Reformation, protest and reform, weren't able to make the Catholic Church change their minds. And so Protestants broke away. And all Protestants essentially rejected in some way the Pope, which is not mentioned in the Bible. The sacraments, which again, many of the rituals and sacraments that occur in the Catholic Church were not specifically mentioned in the Bible. Purgatory, which is not mentioned in the Bible. And the idea here is that the Bible is the only truth. People should seek to read the Bible. This happened at the same time that the printing press was rolling out in Europe, and so this was able to spread quickly because the printing press made it a lot easier to pass information from place to place. And this also made it so that the literacy rate in Europe was beginning to rise. So what did the Catholic Church do? At first, the Catholic Church did nothing. They saw no reason to change. They saw Martin Luther as the one who had the problem, not them. Second, they got a little bit angry. The Spanish Inquisition was this time period when the church started to take away rights from Protestants, Jews, and Muslims in Spain and tortured and killed thousands of different people. Eventually, the Catholic Church did make changes. The Counter-Reformation or the Catholic Reformation essentially cleaned up the Catholic Church. They got rid of some of that corruption and began to put more of an emphasis on education and becoming more appealing to the people who were leaving the church and going to become Protestants. So major changes and continuities here. The biggest change was that the Christian church went through another major split. The power of the church was therefore weakened because the people in the communities saw this as a struggle that the church didn't have control of itself. Some continuities, though, are that Christianity was still the name of the game in Europe. Everybody was still a Christian. They were now just two different major different branches, Catholics and Protestants. And conflict has really always existed in religion and the way that people view religious beliefs has always kind of differed from church to church. The effects of this in the short term are that we have these new Protestant religions and that the church loses a lot of power. And in the long term, new interpretations of the Bible and more reform and further change has led to literally thousands of different denominations of Christianity, mostly Protestant denominations. And so a lot of these churches that sprang up since the Reformation have been kind of local versions of Protestantism.